Our last roundtable for today has to do with Agenda 2030, the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation is organizing this roundtable. Our moderator is Dr. Zosha Destas-Kroponetsky-Gruber. Dr. Zosha Destas-Kroponetsky-Gruber.
And gender specialist at the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation. And this conversation will also feature Aspen Ho, who is a student at Simon Fraser University, and Liliana Cois-Loisel, Manager of Indigenous Youth Engagement and Reconciliation at VIDEA, VD, or another form pronunciation. So actually, before maybe I pass it off to Dr. Zosha, Liliana, could you please educate me? How do you say your organization's name?
Yeah, great question. It's VIDEA. So think like idea with a V in front of it.
Okay, so let me just emphasize how I was completely wrong in all of my efforts. My big apologies. Anyway, after you, Dr. Zosha.
Great, thank you so much. Well, first, let me say you actually pronounced my name correctly, so thank you. And it's an absolute honor to moderate the session on a topic which is very close to my heart. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that BCCIC's work takes place in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tsawwassen nations. And I make this acknowledgement to pay profound respect to the hosts of this land for their stewardship for time immemorial, and to remind us all of both their history and their present-day contributions to our society as a whole. At a more personal level, I would also like to acknowledge that as a South African, I owe much of my position, power, and privilege to the lives of racialized communities who were oppressed by the apartheid regime in which I grew up. My contributions to international development cannot atone for, undo, or reverse the horrific repression and bloodshed of millions of racialized persons in South Africa. But I can use my place and position to honor those who as individuals and as communities resisted, fought back, and advocated for their fundamental rights and freedoms. So for all the communities unjustly oppressed and denied basic human rights and freedoms, including the victims and survivors of the despicable Russian invasion in Ukraine, and for all those exercising their agency in everyday struggles of resistance, I'd like to hold a minute of silence. And I'd also like to encourage you to take a few moments to acknowledge the land you are on, the people who have suffered and resisted before you in the chat box. So today we will be discussing the Leave No One Behind pledge, which is a cross-cutting theme of the Sustainable Development Goals. The event we're hosting today presents a unique opportunity to consider innovative ways that youth draw on lived experience to deconstruct, decolonize, and reimagine the Leave No One Behind pledge in their research, outreach, and advocacy, and what this means for their real and meaningful participation in decision-making around the 2030 agenda. So as we start this event, I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the amazing Lindsay Chipperwan from VIDEA, an Indigenous artist who designed the poster you will see displayed right now. Inspired by the BCCIC wave logo, Lindsay drew a canoe with a chain of hands. These hands are holding onto each other, leaving no one behind. There's even a person falling and being caught if you look closely. Thank you, Lindsay. That's incredible work. So I'd like to introduce our incredible panelists. Aspen is a first-year undergraduate student at Simon Fraser University, but she's also an LGBTQ2IS+ youth activist, a youth journalist, and she has worked in the field of mental health and inclusion for the Red Cross. Lily is the Manager of Indigenous Youth Engagement and Reconciliation at VIDEA, but she's also the 2022 Top 30 Under 30 recipient at the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation, a representative on DIGNA's Youth Working Group, and an executive on the University of Calgary's Indigenous Student Council. And then last but not least, Anika Zomi is a community engagement and gender specialist at the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. She's also the Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for Leading Change Canada and the Chair of Girls Action Foundation. So it's now time to hear from our amazing speakers, but if you have any questions, please insert them in the chat and we will try to respond to them afterwards. So let's start with you, Aspen. how have you tried to decolonize and reimagine the Leave No One Behind pledge in your work and everyday life?
Yeah, so I was the editor-in-chief of my school newspaper for about 3 years, where I really focused on steering youth towards global and local engagement, whether that was raising awareness for the housing crisis in Vancouver, racial injustices, and other such topics. I was also a Red Cross facilitator for our Schools Beyond the Hurt program, where I ended up focusing a lot on mental health and the acceptance and safety of queer youth in our community. And in terms of the Leave No One Behind pledge, if you look at the language it uses of leaving no one behind, it sort of makes the assumption that there are people ahead that are reaching their hand back and bringing up people who are behind. But who's to say that the people ahead or who are more privileged know in which direction we should be going or know what kind of help the people behind need? So if you look at my work, it's more about empowering these so-called marginalized identities and sort of giving them their own platform to speak and direct and become their own leaders when I'm training my youth team or when I'm educating people on how to speak in the queer community and how to take care of their own mental health so they can go on and become their own leaders in today's world.
Thank you, Aspen. And I love how you actually gave us a very graphic description of this idea of someone reaching back and giving a hand up to someone behind. Lily, is this something you've engaged with in your work at VIDEA?
Definitely, yeah. And yeah, again, just Aspen, that way you described it so good and interesting. And I definitely agree. The language there is just the idea of someone being in front, talking to those behind. It should be more talking to them and walking beside them. And I think the way to do that and the way that I do that in my work, and we do this at VIDEA, the organization I work for, is to decolonize our processes, our organization, ourselves. And so that's a lot of difficult work, but we do that at an individual level. And Sasha did a great job of this just in her introduction, recognizing the power and privilege you have, the position you're in, and learning about the history and context to what brought us to this position in place is step one in this decolonizing process. And then the next part is creating spaces for youth. And I'll be talking about this a lot, the importance of safe decolonized spaces so we can walk beside those who are quote unquote behind, walk beside them, learn from them, and recognize diverse knowledge sets and recognize the power in everyone's voices and the intersecting identities and the work that they're doing in engaging with the SDGs and in development work in the lives that they live. And so we do that at VIDEA in many different ways. And the biggest one is creating those safe spaces to amplify those voices and work with the youth we get to engage with every day and learn from them and from each other.
Thank you, Lily. I love this, not just working for or acting on behalf of youth, it's working with youth and learning with youth. Anika, I know that you organize many delegations for OCIC, that you're also involved in various different policy platforms. Has decolonization or reimagining the Leave No One Behind pledge been a part of your work?
Thanks so much, Sasha, for the question and for having me. Quickly acknowledging that I'm joining from traditional Haudenosaunee Anishinaabe, 2 Row Wampum Belt and Dishwick One Spoon territory, known along settler lines as St. Catharines, Niagara Region, Ontario. When I think about this question, and I'm so grateful to Aspen for providing that graphic representation, I think that is one of the biggest pieces that people think about when we talk about Leave No One Behind. This assumption that there are folks in front whose responsibility it is to reach back and bring up those who are behind. But there isn't necessarily a conversation about the knowledge or the information or the practices, policies, and impact felt by those who are quote unquote behind. And when I think through my public programming, when I think through the work that we do at OCIC, I really try to reflect on what does decolonization mean in practice, not just in the words we say, but what does it mean when we talk about the way that we create programs, we structure them, the way that we value lived experience. And 2 things that really come to mind. I think the first piece is really shifting our perspective of what is considered valuable or validated frameworks of public engagement. I think there's been a lot of, and especially in the international development or international cooperation sector, there's a a large legacy of colonization and colonialism that impact the way that work is done today and the way that work is assumed to be, quote unquote, best practice. And really shifting that to say, well, is that really the best way of knowing? Are those the bodies of knowledge that we should be leaning on, or are there new, different, traditional forms of knowledge that we can lean on? One example is storytelling, used by some Indigenous communities to share lessons, to teach knowledge, and the movement away from necessarily needing indicators and specific metrics, and rather allowing stories to stand on their own and share lessons, or allowing folks to pull out lessons depending on what is needed from them in that moment. And the second piece that is really dear to my heart is valuing lived experience as equal to, if not more important sometimes, than what is considered, quote unquote, validated qualifications. It is just as important for someone who has a lived experience of self-sufficient farming or Indigenous sustainability practices to be at the same table as someone who may have a degree in clean energy or sustainability, in order to move towards a whole of sector, continuous holistic approach to sustainability or decolonization or equity. It's exactly what Lily was saying around, it's not just folks in front and folks behind, it's walking together and building on multiple forms of knowledge to walk together.
Thank you, Anika. I'm very interested in this aspect of storytelling. Through our own work at BCCIC and even the e-zine we produced last year, we found out that stories are a powerful medium of sharing lived experience, but they're also very personalized and highly contextual. So let's play devil's advocate a little bit. How will a policymaker actually use, say, 30, 40 stories of very individualized experience, and how can they then translate that information to form that evidence base around which to make policies? Lily, I know that you work extensively with stories and you facilitate an excellent storytelling evening at VIDEA. Have you given any thought on how these type of stories can then be elevated up and used by policymakers?
Definitely, yeah, that's such a great question. And as Asha mentioned, at VIDEA, we have a storytelling night, storytelling hour every week on Monday evenings, where we invite folks from our community, specifically youth, to join us from all over the world, not just here in Canada. And they share their stories, their lived experiences, their knowledge. And it's really, really powerful. And we learn so much from them. I learn more from those storytelling nights than I do from most events or panels or things like that. Just hearing their stories is really powerful. So that question of how do we bring those stories to those decision-making tables is such a great question. And I think, again, it goes back to that idea of these spaces. These voices telling these stories should be at those decision-making tables and should be heard, but often those spaces aren't comfortable or aren't safe for these people who are sharing these stories. So it's about creating those spaces at those higher levels so that these youth and people who might be considered marginalized feel safe to share those stories in the same way that they do in our informal storytelling night every Monday. And one of the ways that we can do that is making youth feel more confident in their own voices, which is something that we're able to do at these storytelling nights as well. They're able to feel more confident and empowered in sharing their stories with a few of us at storytelling. And then from there, we encourage them and push them to join these spaces and to be at these tables, these decision-making tables, to share those same stories and to empower them and to know that those stories are important and should be heard.
Lily, I must say, you're not just a competent speaker. None of you are. You're all very, very powerful speakers and have found seats at the table in various different, either provincial levels or at the federal level. What made you successful? What helped you along the way to be able to translate your lived experience to very tangible advocacy, research, outreach, campaigns with marginalized youth? Aspen?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an important question. And I think what really helped me was having a supportive environment, of having adults that can make sure I'm safe in my advocacy, because it can be such a topic that's possible for backlash, or that's painful because of memories or traumatic experiences. So what I think what really started for me was when I came out to my household. They were super supportive and they were open to educating themselves, and being heard like that was very empowering for me. And then when I went on to do my work in the Red Cross, and I was talking to my teachers about opening up dialogue about queer acceptance and queer safety, they were also super supportive and gave me the resources to do that type of work. And also the faculty made sure that the channels of which people could bully me through were sort of closed to me, or that posters we put up were around security cameras so that we could catch if people were defacing them. So just the supportive community that's not just a household or not just a single teacher, but really a network of people that are keeping these youth safe and encouraged and feeling that they matter is super important for advocacy.
Fantastic. So the interpersonal context was very important for you. That's wonderful. Lily, what was key for your success and ability to advocate for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. For me, I mean, it's very similar as to what Aspen was talking about, just a strong community and feeling like I had active allies in my life who were supporting me and pushing me. Something that I struggled with and continue to struggle with is that idea of imposter syndrome, which I know so many people can relate to, and feeling like your voice isn't important and you don't have anything of value to bring to the table. So something that really pushed me and encouraged me to share my voice and advocate for myself and my community was folks just showing me that I did have a strong voice and that my knowledge and my lived experience was important to share. So, I mean, I do give a lot of credit to VIDEA, the organization I work for. I started off as an intern, and they just really showed me that there are spaces out there for me to share my voice and that it's important to do so. So their encouragement really had a big impact on me and has influenced me to try to do the same for other youth and to open up those spaces of engagement and make youth feel comfortable in sharing their voice.
Yeah, I know from experience, Lily, you are an incredible peer mentor and you're actually such a leader within the community at VIDEA. And it's wonderful to see how allies actually helped you along that process. Anika, what for you stood out in terms of your lived experience?
Great question. And this is a question I get a lot because I am very open about the fact that I'm a Muslim woman of color and I come from other intersectional identities. And a lot of people ask me, you know, why do you orient yourself in this way? And it's interesting because I think about the fact that I never really had the luxury of choice. And I'm sure that this is something that a lot of youth or a lot of people who come from systemically underprivileged communities will relate to. I didn't have the choice of whether or not people would perceive me in the way that I am, that I'm a Muslim woman of color, that I have all of these identities. And therefore, it was super important for me to equip myself with the knowledge to be able to articulate what that meant and how it impacted me. Something that I always talk about when I run anti-oppression sessions is the power of language and recognizing that in knowing the words to identify the experiences you are having, you are able to then articulate why it impacts you. One example is racism can sometimes manifest in kind of invisible instances. I think now we talk about it often as microaggressions. And how do you articulate to someone that it's completely inappropriate to ask, where are you from? No. Where are you really from? Multiple times, unless you understand the larger systems that you exist in and you understand that and are able to name it and therefore be able to connect these individual instances to those larger systems. And so one of the reasons that I was able to I was put in a position of articulating this or orienting my lived experiences was because I didn't really have the choice not to. And by being able to name those situations and be able to step into my power, I was then able to articulate why I was then the best positioned to speak to the challenges impacting those that look like me and those that come from communities like myself. And really that speaking back to that piece that we shared in the first question about allowing those who are quote unquote behind to speak for themselves. They are the experts in their own experiences. They are the ones that know what they need and what challenges they are facing in their context. And so why are we not consulting them? And why are we not allowing them to step into their power and autonomy? Power and autonomy they already have, but that they should be allowed to access in conversations, in dialogues, and at these tables.
Anika, that's a really interesting phrase there, stepping into their power or stepping into your power. I mean, what should we be doing in development to create this enabling environment so that youth can step into their power? I mean, often when we talk about the Leave No One Behind pledge, there's reference to these vulnerable youth, and let's empower the vulnerable youth. How do those phrases make you feel, Aspen?
Yeah, so it feels, for me, it feels very one-dimensional in terms of, yes, I am a queer person of color, and yes, I lived as a girl for most of my life, but I also worked as an educator, and I worked as sort of an editor-in-chief, and I worked in these volunteer positions where I do have a leadership role, and I have used my own power to educate youth and to find these opportunities. So labeling me and labeling other youth advocates as vulnerable really sort of ignores that, all of those experiences, and ignores our power and our own agency, and reduces us to some sort of entity that needs to be pitied or needs to be given resources because we don't have our own, which is entirely untrue and sort of is a step back from where we need to be going.
Lily, I know VIDEA intentionally tries to move away from that type of empowerment model, giving youth resources. What does VIDEA do so differently in terms of the way it sees empowerment or the way it engages with this category of vulnerability?
Yeah, another great question. And just to echo what Aspen said about just that, what can happen when you're talking about and you label someone as being vulnerable, and it prevents them from stepping into their power, and it really silences their voice and reduces their dignity by labeling them in this way that really kind of goes away from the intersectionality of their identities. And that's something at VIDEA we really emphasize, is just the intersectionality and the uniqueness of everyone, their experiences, their talents, just who they are, their identity, and not having just one label on them, because what can happen with that is that one label on them can lead to tokenization and performative allyship. So something at VIDEA we strive to do is move away from that and instead practice active allyship. So instead of just a presentation of support without actual support, practicing solidarity and actually looking at breaking down the oppressive systems and behaviors that lead to that tokenization and that idea of them being vulnerable. Why are they considered vulnerable? It's not their fault. It's systemic. Looking into that, breaking it down, better understanding it, and then from there moving to change that. So that's something that we do try to do, and looking at that as an identity, not as an identity, but more as an action.
Anika, I see you're nodding your head there. Does OCIC adopt the same approach?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because every time I hear the word vulnerable, my eyes roll to the back of my head. I hate the term because I think, and it's what Aspen and Lily have touched on, the term vulnerable or the term marginalized or the term excluded seems to implicitly place the onus of this exclusion on those communities, as if it's for some reason the fault of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, or it's the fault of LGBTQ plus communities that they are marginalized. And I think that filters down to a lot of those rhetoric of when sometimes panels are called out for, why don't you have more diversity? Well, we tried to find someone, but we couldn't. No one was interested. And it perpetuates that notion that these communities are inherently defective or aren't able to do the work well. And so what I've really been trying to do, and back to that whole piece of language being powerful, is actually shift the way that we talk about these communities. One example is that of the movement away from homeless to unhoused, because homeless implies that it is the individual who is without a home's fault for not having a home, whereas unhoused actually touches on the systemic responsibility of the state to provide safety or provide housing. whatever your political leaning is on that. That is the reason behind a lot of that conversation. And so when I talk about these communities, I don't talk about vulnerable communities. I talk about systemically marginalized, systemically excluded, because it's not the individual's fault that they're excluded. It's the fact that the systems are working exactly the way that they were built to, which was to only position a certain demographic of people in a position of power.
I think this point about language is really important. I mean, as we know, especially in terms of the SDGs, that actually language can exclude rather than include. But the same goes for categories. Now, if you look at a lot of the policy documents around the Leave No One Behind pledge, such as the Towards 2030 Agenda, the Moving Towards 2030 Agenda in Canada, they refer to the inclusion or participation of specific categories of youth, such as Indigenous youth, racialized youth, LGBTQIAS+ youth, youth with disabilities, and so forth. How do these categories make you feel? Aspen?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So on one hand, yes, labels and categorization can be helpful in sort of finding people that may have similar experiences to you. But in terms of trying to figure out the problems in our societies or trying to make them into statistics, if we just take one category as BIPOC people or one category as queer people, then it sort of ignores all of our intersecting identities. Like, for example, I am a queer person, but I'm also from a Chinese immigrant family, and my struggles or my strengths, it's impossible to tell which factors come from where because it's so intertwined in my identity. For example, when I'm trying to figure out some hurdles in socially transitioning because of my gender identity, I have to deal with some specific cultural hurdles that come with a traditional Chinese family in terms of my extended family, that some other people from other cultures may have different versions of these hurdles or may not have these types of hurdles at all. And it really ignores that nuance and kind of condenses these issues into something that seems easy to solve, but really aren't.
Yeah, often I find it's ticking the box. Have we got the right people at the table? Do they fit into these certain categories? What is a more nuanced way of approaching this type of categorization in relation to the Leave No One Behind pledge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's bringing in that idea of intersectionality, and just going off of what Aspen said, it really puts people into boxes when you're labeling them in one category and oversimplifies and ignores that intersectionality of their identities. And similar to the label of vulnerability, and as Anika said, it's kind of all of that kind of is, there's a bit of tension in that because it does put them in that box. And if you're at a table speaking as someone who is Indigenous, you're wearing that hat, and that is the category that you are a part of. Your voice is only representing that identity to a lot of people, and that's just not sustainable. So really talking about intersectionality and acknowledging everyone's unique intersectional identity, and the complicated nature of our identities and our lived experiences and what brings us to this point now is much more empowering in our individual and collective choices and agency. So recognizing that intersectionality is very important, and it can lead to a more holistic understanding of the issues that actually bring up and lead to these inequalities, marginalization, and injustices that we are looking at in the Leave No One Behind pledge, and ultimately allow us as a collective to empower one another and actually reach solutions to moving away from that.
Lily, I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a second. I'm a policymaker and I'm organizing a roundtable. How do I know that I've got the right people at the table? I mean, if we're not using quotas for certain groups of individuals or communities who are marginalized or at risk of being left behind, how do we ensure that everyone is represented and that those with lived experiences have a place and a platform for their voices? Anika?
This is a great question, Zasha, because I sit between this tension, and I'll kind of share both sides of it. So the first piece is, in order to move beyond just quotas of naming, we have 2 Indigenous youth, then 2 Black youth, and 1 queer youth, it's actually talking about what does their identity mean to the work that's being done? How does it fundamentally change? And this is a concept that I try to distinguish between practical diversity and representative diversity. Representative diversity is, say you have a panel of white men and you switch one out for a Black woman and the work gets done exactly the same. That's representative diversity. Diversity for the sake of saying you have representation. But if you have the same panel of white men and you switch one out for a Black woman and the work fundamentally changes because that Black woman is bringing her experiences into shifting the way that the work is done, that's practical diversity, diversity in practice. So when we're talking about quotas and we're talking about identifying 3 Indigenous youth or 2 queer youth or 1 trans youth, it's not about filling quotas. It's not about just saying we have a group of folks. It's actually reflecting on the different bodies of knowledge, the difference in lived experience in order to inform that the ways the work is done is, like we've touched on already, the impact that these communities feel is different. And therefore, who better to speak to the impact that they will face than those from the communities themselves? And so it really is about not just saying, what is your identity, but actually, what does that mean in the way that you do your work? What does that mean in the way that you approach these conversations? But I also sit with this strange tension of, but no one is entitled to know your story. And I think a lot of the systems we exist in feed into this almost like trauma porn experience of, in order to justify the fact that you are Indigenous or you're racialized or you're a woman, you have to relive the trauma or the challenges of existing with that identity in order to justify why you are the right person to speak on that. Can an Indigenous person not just be trusted to do the work from an Indigenous perspective without rehashing all of the trauma they faced in a colonial system? And so how do we sit in this space of valuing lived experience and recognizing that these identities come with the really unique, nuanced lenses that no one else can replicate, without putting these individuals, especially young people, in a position of more harm by forcing them to relive the trauma in order to advocate for their right to exist in that space and operate from that lens?
So, Nika, just to clarify, you're suggesting that in our efforts to foreground or prioritize the voices of those persons with lived experience from marginalized communities, we're actually also putting them in a very difficult position because they have to justify their presence at the table, for instance, by telling the story or sharing the story?
Absolutely. And I shared this already. I'm a Muslim woman of color, and I talk often about what that means when I'm in different spaces. But in order to justify why my perspective is different, and I have to then rehash maybe the racist experiences or the sexist experiences or the Islamophobic experiences in order to say, because I've had these experiences that no one else who doesn't come from a similar background has had, that's why I'm the right person to speak on that. As if my identity itself is not in and of itself enough to be trusted. And it's something that we don't necessarily ask from folks from privileged backgrounds. We don't ask men to talk about what does it mean to be a man in international development, or what does it mean to be straight as a humanitarian worker. We don't ask that question. So why are we making folks from communities that are already systemically marginalized justify their spot at the table?
Lily, I see you also nodding your head again. Is this something that you've experienced, and is it something that you engage with at VIDEA?
Yes, most definitely. And it's such a good point to bring up and a good conversation to have, because I feel like that can happen a lot, that idea of trauma porn, and you have to share your story, even if that is making you relive your trauma. And it's something at VIDEA we try to avoid and make everyone feel safe, and that their voice is important and they can share their stories, but also that they don't need to if that is not good for them and not healthy for them. So we just want everyone to feel supported in doing what they want and hearing their stories, but also if they don't choose to, then they don't need to. A big part of how we do that is just, and I talked about this earlier, just building those relationships, gaining that trust, and having those relationships that are rooted in respect and reciprocity, taking the time to get to know everyone we work with instead of just working with them in a program and then they're done and we never talk to them again. Something else as well is to celebrate the positive stories and the power and the strength and resilience that everyone we work with has. That's so important. There's so much joy in some of the stories we get to hear and the experiences we get to learn from. And so we want to celebrate and elevate those stories as well, just as much as the stories that might involve trauma and issues. So to do that, again, it's just about having those spaces where they can share all stories, no matter what they want. And as well, we really highlight the importance of wellness at VIDEA, and that's something we try to incorporate into all our programs and projects, is the importance of wellness, taking time away if you need it. We have a Wellness Wednesday every week for Indigenous youth, which is a space for youth to come and take in wellness workshops from Indigenous facilitators across Turtle Island. So we really emphasize just wellness and those spaces to share what you want to share.
Lily, that's very important, this idea that we need to focus on well-being as part of the Leave No One Behind pledge. But also you raised an important point about we shouldn't be focusing on stories of trauma or focusing on stories of vulnerability and risk, but rather highlighting or encouraging stories around survival and resilience and resistance and power. And I know Aspen contributed to our e-zine, and she wrote an incredible story about her bravery and the way in which she broke down barriers, attitudinal barriers, societal barriers, socioeconomic barriers, and so forth, in her daily life. Aspen, do you find that you're encouraged to share those type of stories, or is there a tendency to hang on to the vulnerability and try and get you to focus on that aspect of your story?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think when I was first asked to do that article, I was a bit concerned because at that point in my life, I hadn't really encountered much discrimination in terms of for my gender or for my sexuality back then. And then I was a little concerned. I remember having a conversation with you where I didn't feel like I was worthy of sharing my story because I hadn't met some sort of quota of suffering. So then my story wasn't worth sharing. And that, as Lily was talking about, some imposter syndrome sort of set in. But then I realized that the power of stories is sharing your entire identity and your entire experience. And we really shouldn't just be focusing on the bad parts or the vulnerable parts, because then it doesn't show the strength or the resilience or what can be done right, or how to facilitate the growth and the queer youth specifically, and how to have them be confident and not just be victims of abuse or victims of hate crimes. And it really highlights the strength. And I found that writing that article helped me sift through those feelings and realize that, yes, this is what we need more of this. We need more of focusing on the strength and the power that queer youth have.
One of you have focused on reflection and spoken about the importance of considering power and privilege. I mean, this has also become a buzz term, but really that notion of reflexivity. But how does one do that at an organizational level, or scaling that up at an institutional level, or at the level of governance? How should we be thinking about development programming and international cooperation differently and informed by that type of reflection? Anika?
This is a great question, Sasha, and I think there are threads that the other speakers have already touched on that I can just highlight here. Thinking of different ways of knowledge, banking on lived experience is equal to, if not more valuable than validated signs of knowledge and information. allowing space or creating spaces or creating spots at the table for folks who are systemically underrepresented, like youth or queer youth or folks that come from intersectional identities, and recognizing the power in stories. Something that I also think about in terms of also sitting with this tension of how do we not put folks in the position of rehashing trauma, but also still recognizing the importance of lived experience is, and a big piece of it is trusting communities, trusting individuals to know what they want to share and what they want to disclose. So if someone wants to come and talk about their personal experience, we're not forcing them to, and we're not positioning ourselves as entitled to their story, but knowing that they are choosing in their own right to share that, and that they know their own capacity. It's not censoring those individuals. But in order to do that, and in order to facilitate those kind of contexts, a big piece of it is setting up the environment to allow them to stay safe beyond. It's naming that when you're talking about when you're recruiting or when you're running an event, naming the importance of lived experience. When you're recruiting volunteers or hiring, naming and weighting lived experiences equal to quote unquote validated degrees or work experience. But also, how are you creating a space outside of them disclosing that type of experience? Are you providing them resources that they can access should that trauma trigger, should that reliving that trigger some trauma? And I know that some organizations and some conferences I've been to have had like an Indigenous elder in residence, or I've been to an event on racialized trauma in academia where they had a social worker come in and be available to step into a breakout room in a Zoom call if that did trigger, those conversations did trigger that. Are we also, and I think Lily touched on this, are we also building relationships of trust and not relationships of exploitation? Those of you in the room who are researchers will know that best practices when you're working with communities is to ensure that you're sharing back any deliverables, any learnings with the communities that you're learning from. It's not just about taking from them, but also giving back and continuing to build that relationship of trust so they don't feel tokenized. They can see how they fit into a larger picture. And finally, keeping that relationship open. For example, at OCIC, when we run events, we try to keep our speakers in mind for future opportunities or invite them to future events so that they recognize that we're not just, like I said, exploiting them or taking advantage of their interest or expertise for that one event, but that they are part of our network, part of our community. And then if folks do have challenges, if they do need to access additional support, if they need to debrief, they know that there's a relationship there they can reach out to and request whatever it is they need, whatever supports it is that they need, even beyond maybe that event or that engagement or that program, because they've built an actual relationship, and it's a relationship built on trust.
Thank you, Anika. That's very useful. Lily, VIDEA has produced a very comprehensive toolkit that can be used by organizations when trying to decolonize and when trying to think through some of these issues. Can you give us a few highlights from that and key takeaways for organizations in the audience today?
Yeah, for sure. And I wonder if there's a way we can share the resource for the decolonization toolkit, because it is available for anyone to use. And the first thing I just want to touch on is just the importance at individual, organizational, and institutional levels to recognize the colonial and oppressive roots of development and the legacy that these roots continue to have in our sector. As we all know, Canada today remains a white settler colonial state that practices neocolonialism on its Indigenous, immigrant, and marginalized populations. And our sector, the international development sector, arguably more than any other sector, needs to be doing this decolonial work in order to actually achieve true, just, and sustainable development. It can't happen without this decolonial work being done, breaking down the system that does remain oppressive. So at a policy level, marginalized voices won't truly be valued, included without this work being done. And this decolonial work takes a lot of hard work and tough conversations and change at all levels, but it's so important. And just, I know we're running out of time. I could talk about this for a long time, but a couple of examples at a systemic and organizational level is just changing the language. Language, as we all know, is so important, and it can often be very inaccessible in the development sector. So it's so important to make it more accessible in order to leave no one behind. We need to make it more accessible, easy to understand, because if we don't, the inaccessible language just perpetuates that power dynamic and further silences important voices who are the ones we need to be listening to and heard. And then another point too is just that, and we've touched on this in the past while already, but just the importance of recognizing diverse sets of knowledge around the world, such as ancestral or traditional knowledge and life experiences, instead of just looking at Western education standards like a university degree as an example, because they are not the experts when it comes to these issues. Those who actually have lived through those experiences, they are the experts. So I really encourage everyone to do this important work within their circles and their networks in order for us to truly leave no one behind.
Lenny, this, and all of you have spoken about weighing up and balancing lived experience and valuing it as much as professional experience or academic experience. But it's very difficult. So from my perspective, we sent out a call for delegates to join our delegation to the 66th session on the Commission on the Status of Women, which is starting in a week's time. And we received incredible applications from individuals living in the global south, such as Zambia, Afghanistan, various parts of Central and Southern America. But also we received applications from individuals who've got 20 years of experience working as a development practitioner or who've got PhDs. How does one decide between all of those different experiences and types of knowledge? I mean, in the end, to be honest, what we did is we accepted all the applications because I felt that in my position, who am I to say that one experience, lived experience, is more valid than another lived experience? Or, I don't know. Anika, how do you deal with this type of issue?
It's such a great question because, Sasha, I'm the same. We just go, let's accept everybody because, there's such a value in having such interdisciplinary, intergenerational, cross-sectoral conversations. But I also think the premise of that question assumes that lived experience and validated degrees or education are mutually exclusive, and they're not. And I think that's the biggest piece is there's this assumption that folks with lived experience somehow don't have all the other qualifications that will allow them to be successful in spaces. For example, we're not saying that somebody should, not go to school or apply for a job that's saying it needs an associate's degree without having one. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that the lived experience in and of itself is a qualification, and we should highlight that in those conversations. So it's not so much about deciding between someone who was Black versus someone with a PhD. Those are apples and oranges. It's actually talking about the fact that sometimes people with academic experience also have lived experience, and that may position them as more attuned to the problem or more attuned to the reality of the context because they both studied it and lived it, as opposed to someone who may only have the degree and not any of that lived experience. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, Sasha, but that's something that I really think about when I think through our selection of delegates, our hiring process, is that lived experience and those real qualifications, those quote unquote real qualifications, are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they enhance one another and build on each other.
Thank you. That's a very good response. It doesn't help now that I've got 47 delegates that we are supporting, but okay, so we have now time to answer questions from the audience. I don't see any in the chat though, so I'm not sure how they get fed up. So while we wait for questions from the audience, I'm going to open the floor and shift it around a little bit. I'm going to invite you to ask each other a question.
I have a question for Aspen. Aspen, I'm wondering, what advice would you have for youth who are just starting to engage in advocacy, engagement, other work related to the SDGs?
Oh my gosh, I was hoping somebody would ask this question. So as I was growing into advocacy, I was a mad overworker. I would burn out maybe every other month or so. But yeah, I was just taking on so much. And especially when you're first starting out with advocacy, it can seem like there's so many global problems, and they're all like these fires burning, and you're not sure how to help, because they're so complicated and so deeply rooted in our society that there is no one solution. And as a young person, it can seem so overwhelming that you need to be on it every single day to sort of try and make even a little bit of a difference. But the thing is, we're sort of all in this together, and it's not up to you solely by yourself to make these big changes. So you need to take it easier on yourself. You need to be more forgiving. You need to take a break, because if you don't take a break, you will burn out. And that's just not sustainable if you want to turn it into lifelong advocacy, because that's what really does make a difference. So just finding that support system of your family or your friends or your teachers that remind you to go take a bike ride, or go, I don't know, eat your favorite kind of cake, or something that just makes you happy and makes you feel rejuvenated. And you don't have to be working all the time, and just, yeah, take it easy on yourself.
Thank you, Lily and Aspen. Anika, do you have any questions for Lily or Aspen before
actually, it's funny that Aspen talks about this overworking burnout. I have a friend who calls the nonprofit sector a system of the nonprofit industrial complex, this like weird implication that you have to work yourself into the ground in order to justify that you care about the work that you do, where that's not sustainable. But I do have a question for both Lily and Aspen. Actually, putting on my programs hat as somebody who works in an organization that does have that situational power. What is it that you, as young people who come from these diverse backgrounds, would like these organizations to do in order to more effectively support your participation, or the participation of folks from your communities that may not have as many opportunities to access? What can we do better?
Such a great question. Maybe I can start off and then pass it to you, Aspen. As I mentioned, I started off at VIDEA as an intern. So I found their program to do an international internship in Uganda, and I signed up and got accepted and did it. And something that I really quickly learned that VIDEA, that we do differently than a lot of other organizations, is they build those relationships with you that are lasting. They go beyond the program ending. And the fact that I work for VIDEA now is proof of that, right? I finished my internship. And I think a lot of times what happens is organizations, you're done your internship. It was great getting to know you. All the best with the rest of your life. But I don't think that's very sustainable. And that's something that I think all organizations should really look at, is how to continue growing that relationship at the end of a program, whether that be a program where youth are, taking more of a leadership role or a participant role, building those relationships with them, and then continuing on afterwards, because there's so much value you can get from those relationships afterwards. They can return as leaders like I did, or, get you connected with other organizations they might be working for in different circles. There's just so many benefits to staying connected with program participants at the end of their program, and just building on that afterwards in different capacities. So that's the first thing I would think of. And I guess I especially feel strongly about that because I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for that.
Yeah, definitely, Lily, what you said about having these sort of lifelong connections that go beyond like the organization. If I think about mentors that were really meaningful to me, such as teachers or program coordinators, they're always like, oh, I'm now your mentor for life, or I'm your teacher for life, and you can come back. And I think especially when you're getting into advocacy, it can be very scary if you don't have some sort of backbone or some sort of person you can ask for advice that's really involved in that sector. So if you have these lifelong coaches or organizations that are there to support you even after you've done the event or done the volunteer position, it can be really encouraging to help you sort of further your advocacy and further that type of work. What I also found really helpful was, again, you were talking about safe spaces where we're really listened to. For example, if you're doing a panel and you need a break or you need somebody to talk to because maybe it's getting too much, then they allow for that and they welcome that sort of asking for what you need, and they do actively provide what you need. And I think that is a very big a marker for a safe space and for an organization that doesn't just use you for as ticking off a box, but really cares for you as a person, as for a young advocate. Yeah.
Thank you. So the session, before we end off, I have one final question for you all. So the session has focused a lot on who should be at the table. It's also focused on how youth from marginalized and underrepresented communities should be treated at the table or listened to at the table. But now if we think about the table itself, what should we be advocating for in terms of policymakers' engagement with the Leave No One Behind pledge? What do you want to see discussed at the table, or what do you want that table to actually look like? Anika?
It's a great question. I have a laundry list of items, but I'll maybe focus on one thing just for the sake of time. And I think the biggest thing that I would really encourage those tables to discuss are different ways to do things. And that's not to add more work to folks' plates, but actually to think through what are, and Lily touched on this really lovely earlier, what are the traditional forms of knowledge or the ancestral forms of knowledge or the indigenous forms of knowledge that we can draw on? It's not about reinventing the wheel. There are systems of economies based on Maori forms of knowledge. There are knowledge of agricultural practices based on indigenous Mexican farmers' knowledge. This is stuff that already exists there. So how can we broaden our scope and think about doing things differently, but also recognize that it's not going to be an easy or comfortable process. And sitting with that discomfort and being willing to sit with that is a really, really big piece that you need to humble yourself and be willing to do in order to achieve the Leaving No One Behind pledge.
Thank you, Anika. Lily, you've got 30 seconds.
I think the biggest thing I would say, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the importance of decolonizing at all different levels, is just I'd love to see the table just take a hard look at themselves and see, okay, who's here right now? What brought them there? Why are they there? Whose voices are not here? Why are those voices not here? How can we bring them here? And just those are just a few examples of the questions that I think the table needs to ask and look at themselves and just go through that process, have those conversations, and really take a lead as a sector in going through that decolonization process to truly reach just and sustainable development and really leave no one behind.
Thank you. Lily and Aspen.
Yeah, so these are wonderful points. And I think all I have to add is that maybe look at who is in power, who is in sort of organizing these events, and who is the big advisors. And do they come with lived experiences, or do they do the work that they are really involved in these issues on a daily basis? Or are they just doing this to present an image that they are working towards this sort of thing? Because I think those are the people that are allowing the space and will ask the questions about who should we alter, who is at this table, or do we need to take a deeper look at ourselves and how we are organizing these types of events?
Thank you, Aspen. So I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing with us so openly and honestly, and bearing the emotional burden of sharing their lived experiences in this space. Being left behind cannot be attributed to one single cause. It cannot be explained with reference to one single factor, characteristic, or identity, and is far more complex than boxes, labels, or categories can explain. And it's certainly far more complex than the Leave No One Behind pledge can do justice to. When we speak of empowering those furthest behind, as it appears in policy documents, we really need to re-examine what the word empowerment means and who is empowering who. Instead of lending a hand to those at the back of the line, we should be walking next to each other to find out if a hand is what is needed, or if we are indeed walking in the right direction. Instead of opening the door for someone else, we should be finding new pathways. And instead of bringing others to the table, we should be discussing what the table should look like. So in this final decade of action, I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to share this space with these powerful speakers. And as a call to action, I encourage you to take a moment to engage in self-reflection and be vulnerable and humble as you enter into dialogues about what human dignity, human rights, and social justice mean for diverse youth and communities today. on that note, I'd like to thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Merci beaucoup, Zosha, Aspen, Anika, and Liliana. Thank you all so much for sharing in this space. This was enriching for me. I loved listening to all of you. I love the fact that we talked about leaving no one behind. How do we know that those who have privilege are, pushing us in the correct direction, right? That idea of leaving no one behind assumes that there's some people at the back of the line. And so that means is the line going the right direction? And then there are folks in front whose responsibility it is to reach back and bring folk in the back, quote unquote, the back up front. There's a lot of talk about decolonization, with this focus on both decolonizing the self and decolonizing organizational practices, because even if you do not hold systemic power within sort of what is currently Canada, there are spaces in which you do hold power, and trying to decolonize those spaces does wonders in sort of the wider value of things. Valuing lived experience and being able to sort of incorporate an understanding of lived experience into what we understand as accomplishments, into what we understand as expertise, and what you understand as bringing quality knowledge to the table. Being able to build upon multiple forms of knowledge and truly work together. And in that discussion around empowerment versus vulnerability gave me frisson, buttons on my hands. That idea of like when you label someone as being vulnerable, it prevents them from stepping into their power and silences them as something to be pitied, which harks back to the opening words we had from Jean Baker, which really said we need to change the narrative that we have around racialized and marginalized folk. Because in seeing them as simply just vulnerable, we're forgetting the level of resilience it takes to be in those vulnerable spaces. And this discussion is so important to have in a Canadian context, especially the discussion about identity and community, because in what is currently Canada, we do have a habit of forming community around oppression, right? If there was no such thing as racism, the Black community in Canada would not exist. If there was no such thing as homophobia, would we have an LGBTQ2 plus community, right? And so we form communities around shared experiences of oppression as a way to A, have affirmation, but then B, also meet people who have similar experiences, similar worldviews, similar perspectives that have been formed and shaped by the oppressions that we face. But then what the ironic impact that has is what happens to those who don't experience systemic oppression? Right? How do they form community? And so the answer is very simple. It's through creating a common enemy. And we saw this with the convoy, right? Many people who joined the convoy, if you read the newspaper reports of that, where they interview people asking them why they joined the convoy, if you listen to some really interesting podcast episodes, there's an episode in Canada Land that I recommend. There was a very strong sense of, I felt like I had a community. People were kind, people were nice, people were welcoming. I felt a sense of belonging. I was able to talk to my neighbor. We were sharing this. We were all these different sort of community aspects that those of us who are racialized and marginalized probably take for granted because we have those relationships with members of other oppressed communities like us. And so by defining community built around oppression, it means that those who do not face that oppression then have to search elsewhere for community. And in that search for community, they tend to create the community through the easiest way to create community, which is via having a common enemy, which is via war. And so this returns to the theme of the conference, Together, Ensemble. It's all about being together, forming communities, building collaboration, seeking to change the narrative and the ways in which we build community in what is currently Canada. And then y'all also touched upon this really key piece, that idea of if you have interns, if you bring people into your spaces and you work well with them, and it was a great experience. At the end of the internship, you're like, well, that was fantastic. Ciao, have a good time. And, I fully sort of understand the whole sort of limited resources thing, but at Future Ancestor Services, the organization that I'm with, we define success not by how many clients we've had, not by how much money we make in a quarter, but by the relationships and the quality of the relationships that we've been able to build with clients. So even when I was being brought on to MC for this event, I had conversations with the Sustainability Development Network where we're getting to know each other as people. It's like finding out who has kids, how they're doing, how's their day going, sending, really sort of inappropriate text messages the entire time, being like, oh my God, did you hear what blah, blah, blah just said? Oh, that's spicy. Really sort of building those connections so that the relationship stays even after the event is over. So that was beautiful. That was brilliant. And I really appreciate that.